Hi everyone, my name is Julia, and today I'm going to be giving you an overview of the top 10 originating countries for EB-5 visas in the past 5 years. We're now going to be looking at a bunch of charts, but before we do, I want to mention 3 things. First, the US government fiscal year begins on October 1st of each year. So fiscal year 2016 numbers would reflect data that was collected between October 1st, 2015 and September 30, 2016. Second, the EB-5 visa numbers reflect the total number of visas that are issued based on the I-526 approvals. And because with one I-526 filing, the investor, their spouse, and unmarried children under the age of 21 can also get the EB-5 visa, one I-526 filing will result in multiple visas. The Department of State has said that on average, approximately 2.8 visas are issued for each I-526. For example, I've done work for foreign students, and in their case, the I-526 would result in 1 visa. But our regional center also had an investor with 5 children, so that investor's I-526 took up to 7 visas. Third, because these are visa numbers and not I-526 filing numbers, and it takes approximately 2 years to get your EB-5 visa after filing the I-526, these numbers are reflecting EB-5 demand that occurred 2 years prior. So let's begin. So let's look at the top 10 EB-5 countries between fiscal year 2012 and 2016. And you can see that it's not surprising that China has always produced the most EB-5 visas. It has been number 1 in the past 5 years. Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, Mexico, these are usually the countries that round out the top 10. If you look at the bottom numbers, you can see the total number of EB-5 visas issued for each year. And you can see that in fiscal year 2014, the EB-5 quota of 10,000 was hit for the first time. Let's go to the next page. This is actually the same chart as we just saw, but I'm highlighting Vietnam. It's very interesting to see that Vietnam just kind of came out of nowhere in fiscal year 2014 to claim 121 visas. As you can see, they were not even in the top 10 during the prior 2 years. But again, as I mentioned in the introduction, these numbers are reflecting demand in EB-5 that happened 2 years ago because these are visa numbers, and visas are issued approximately 2 years after the investment is made and the I-526 is filed. So the fact that Vietnam issued 121 visas in 2014 means that starting 2012, a lot of people in Vietnam started to invest in EB-5. And prior to Vietnam, you can see that South Korea has always been one of the top EB-5 visa producing countries. It was number 2 for the 3 years prior to 2015. Let's look at the next chart, which is also the same chart, but this time I'm highlighting India. There has always been a steady demand for EB-5 in India, not as high as you would think, considering that there's a very high demand for India in EB2, from India for EB2 and EB3s. But maybe that's why we haven't been seeing a big demand in EB5 from Indian nationals, because they've been using other EB-based options. But the interesting thing is in 2016, the numbers started to reach almost 150. And later on, I will be showing you a chart of 2016 I-526 filings, not visa numbers, but I-526 filings. And you can see that demand for EB-5 visas is increasing quite rapidly in India. I think that probably has to do with the fact that the EB2 and EB3 visas have retrogressed, and so there's a very long wait for those on the EB2, EB3 lines. Let's look at the next slide. This is the same chart, but this time I'm highlighting South American countries. Mexico has always had a steady demand for EB-5 visas. In 2016, it didn't make the top 10 for the first time. This has nothing to do with the election because, again, these are numbers for people who filed 2 years prior in 2014. The really interesting thing here is Brazil. Brazil, again, came from out of nowhere to claim 150 visas in 2016. So starting 2014, a lot of people have been filing in Brazil, we can see. On the bottom, I've actually added Brazil's prior year numbers. And so there have always been people from Brazil doing EB-5, but in 2014, the demand really shot up, and we can see that reflected in the 2016 visa issuance numbers. Venezuela has also been a steady user of EB-5 visas. We haven't seen a particular spike recently, but it's interesting to note that they've always produced EB-5 visas. Argentina, you will see, is notably missing, and that has a lot to do with the fact that it's very, very difficult to move US dollars outside of Argentina. Let's look at the next slide. So this chart is very interesting for a number of reasons. The most important thing is that we've never seen this breakdown before, but also because it shows the I-526 approval rates by country, which again, we've never seen before. Unsurprisingly, mainland China is the #1 country in terms of I-526 filings. I mentioned before that Vietnam files a lot of I-526s these days. So if we have 404 people filing in Vietnam, their approval rate is approximately 87%. And each I-526 takes 2.5 visas, we can see that 2 years from now, Vietnam will exceed 700 visas. And 700 is the cutoff for an individual country within EB-5 where they will hit a backlog, which I won't go into too much detail today. The third I-526 country is India. Again, very interesting. You can see that demand from India is growing rapidly, as I mentioned before. One thing to point out about Indian I-526 demand or Indian EB-5 demand is I've found, this is anecdotal, but I found that a lot of it comes from within the United States. So we're not looking at only people in India who are looking to do EB-5, but also people who are already in the United States on non-immigrant visas, such as H-1B or F-1 visas. And I've already done a separate video on that, so you can watch that to see what's going on over there. The interesting thing about India is that it only has a 66% approval rate for I-526s. I'm not quite sure where that is coming from because I've done work for many Indians as well as Chinese, and I don't think documents from India are any less transparent than documents from China. If anything, they're more transparent because the system there is more robust in terms of taxes, tax records, and also a lot of their documents are already in English, but for some reason we're seeing a very low approval rate there. If you look at just the approval rates, you can also see that Iran, which also has shown a steady demand for EB-5. Not high numbers, but a steady demand. But you can see that the numbers from Iran are very low. That mostly has to do with the fact that there are certain large banks in Iran that are on the OFAC list. So the US government has basically placed a bunch of Iranian banks on a blacklist that you can't do transactions with. So if you're unlucky and you're Iranian with money in those banks, it's often hard to pass the source of funds process with an I-526. Also look at Russia. The demand, the I-526 filing was 54 filings, which is actually falling, I think, because we didn't talk about Russia before, but if we look at the charts here, Russia has always shown a steady demand for EB-5 visas. And I think many Russians, they're not single people, they're families. So Russia 54 would translate into maybe 2 or 3 visas, which actually would be higher. I'm sorry, I was wrong, higher than these numbers. So the demand from Russia is in fact growing. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. Very interesting data, especially the last slide. And here we can see on average the I-526 approval rates are 82%. So I-526 approvals depend on 2 things. One is the project documents and the other is the source of funds document. And we've already done a separate video on the I-526 process where I talk about different things that go into the I-526. So we can't really tell if the denial is because they invested in a bad project and something went wrong with the project and everybody was denied, or whether it was a source of funds issue where the particular investor is having a hard time showing the source of funds documentation. So those numbers are not broken down that way, but we know, for example, for Iran, most of the problems originate from the source of funds issue and not the project side. I hope you found this data interesting, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.